Hello everyone, welcome back to Christian Music History. How's going your week? I'm so good. Yeah, and I'm so happy to study a Christian music history with you. I know it is not easy because these are so many terms and histories and so many new things to you. So I understand it is not easy, and you probably think, why should I learn like this? But think about that, if you understand the Christian music's history, you can see widely, not only this contemporary music, but also you can choose and you can listen and you can also understand what is some Christian music and how to praise God. So I highly recommend you just read the book so many times and focus on our lectures. That is the only good method to understand, because in this class I prepared so many examples, so that is so helpful to understand and conceive what is the music, what is the music at that time, and how to develop music from the ancient to contemporary. So I highly recommend you to do so well, and I know you have done so well. So let's start our fourth class. So today's class is that I'm going to discuss about the polyphony through the 13th century. So this is a timetable, and I'm going to talk about the early organon, Aquitanian polyphony, Notre Dame polyphony, and motet. So before starting to talk about that, I'm going to talk about the 13th century in Western world. So during Europeans' economic growth between 1050 and 1300, the church prospered. Pius the Donor founded hundreds of new monasteries and convents, filled by rising numbers of men, women, and children seeking a Christian's life. So Saint Francis, Saint Dominic, Saint Clare, and the others founded new religious orders. In the 11th and early 12th century, builders built large Romanesque churches that used the principles of the Roman basilica and the round arch, and the artists decorate these buildings with frescoes and sculptures. By the middle 12th century, the craftsmen created a new style of church architecture, later called Gothic, which emphasized the height and the spaciousness with the soaring vaults, the points arches, the slender columns, and the stained glass windows like that. So this is the picture of the Gothic style church, and this is the right one is the stained glass window. So as the scholars revived the ancient learning, Saint Anselm, Saint Thomas Aquinas, and others associated with the intellectual movement called scholasticism, sought to reconcile the classical philosophy of Aristotle and others with Christian doctrine through commentary on authoritative texts. So these developments found a parallel in the polyphony, music in which voices sing together in independent parts. At first, a polyphony was a style of performance, a manner of enriching chant with one or more added voices. Those who sang and heard polyphony valued it as a means of praising God for its beautiful sounds and as decoration, a concept central to medieval art. Polyphony performance heightened the grandeur of chant and those of the liturgy itself, just like art and architecture, decoration, or ornament the church and those the service. The added voice elaborate the authorized chant through a musical gloss, resembling both the monophonic trope and the scholastic commentary on scripture. New develops in the theory and the notation during the 11th to 13th centuries allowed music to elaborate, musicians to elaborate in genres such as organum and the motet. This rise of the written polyphony is of particular interest as it inaugurates four concepts that have distinguished Western music ever since: counterpoint, the combination of a multiple independent line, then the harmony, which is the regulation of a simultaneous sounds, and the centrality of notation, and the idea of a composition as a distinct from performance. These concepts changed over time, but their presence in this music links into all that followed. Polyphony began as a manner of a performance, became a practice of oral composition, and developed into a written tradition. It is easy for us to conceive of polyphony as essentially a tradition of written composition, as music historians used to do, because that is what we see in the manuscript. But we must remember that what was written down was only a small part of the polyphony that was sung, and it requires historical imagination to understand the oral polyphony that exists only in the throats of singers, the ears of listeners, and the minds and memories of performers and composers. So now I'm going to talk about the early organ. Europeans probably performed the music in multiple parts long before it was described. The simplest type, singing or playing a melody against the drone, is found in most European folk traditions and many Asian culture, suggesting it dates from the antiquary or even prehistoric times. Drones typically sustain the modal final, sometimes joined by the fifth above. For the listener, drones ground the melody in its tonal center and heighten the sense of the closure when the melody cadences on the final. Another way to enrich a melody, doubling it in parallel perfect intervals, was apparently already an old practice when first example explained and illustrated in the 9th century treatise, the Musica Enchiriadis. The book used the term organ for two or more voices singing different notes in agreeable combinations according to given rules. This term was used for several styles of polyphony from the 9th through the 13th centuries. The resulting piece is always called an organum, but in referring to the style, it is best to add a modifier. The type shown in this picture is known today as a parallel organ. So please look at the picture. The original chant melody is the principal voice. The organal voice moving in exact parallel motion of fifth below. So fifths were consonances considered both perfect and beautiful. Although parallel fifths would later be forbidden in Renaissance counterpoint to medieval ears, they added resonance and magnificence to an otherwise bare unison. In early organ, the organal voice is normally sung below the principal voice. Either or both the voice may be doubled at the octave to create an even richer sound. So we are going to talk about the mixed parallel and the oblique organum. So the styles of organum described in Musica Ankyriadis were ways for singers to decorate the chant in performance based on strict rules for deriving added voice from the chant. They were not a method of composition, but the next theorist to describe organum, Guido of Arezzo, in his book, although the range of choices that could result in the variety of organal voice, combining oblique and parallel motion, and with choice comes the possibility of composition. In most cases, we can assume these organal voices were composed orally, either improvised by a soloist or worked out in a rehearsal. We have evidence for such oral composition both from theorists and from a few practical sources in which organal voices were written down. The largest source is the Winchester Troper, a manuscript of tropes and other liturgical music from a monastery in Winchester, England. It contains 174 organa for the mass and the office. Only the organal voices are notated. The monks would have known the chant by heart, and in all probability, other organal voices were composed and transmitted orally and were written down as an aid to memory. The scribes concern to fix them in the writing shows that the organum was becoming a form of composition as well as a manner of performing chant. So I'm going to show you what is the parallel organal, a mixed parallel and oblique organum. So this is Rex Celli Domine Maris from the Musica Ankyriadis. So this is a beautiful parallel organ. Now, I'm going to continue to talk about the organum. So first was parallel organum. Now I'm going to talk about the note against the note organum. So a possible way to add an organal voice multiplied, musicians must have a sense of an opportunity to decorate the chant of the service in the same way that sculptors, painters decorated the walls of the churches. By the late 11th century, singers were improvising, scribes were recording a new style of organum, known today as note against note organum, in which the organal voice is more independent and prominent. Rules for improvising or composing in the new style are preserved in ad organum faciendum, which gives as examples the solo sections of the Alleluia Justus ut Palma. As shown in the example on PPT, the added voice now usually lies above the chant rather than below it. Perhaps because that allows a wider range of motion. The organal voice moves against the chant, mostly note for note, in a free mixture of a contrary, oblique, parallel, and similar motion while forming consonant harmonic intervals with it. So look at the picture, and then you can see the differences. So the consonants remain the unison, fourth, fifth, and the octave, with the cadences on the unison or octave sometimes preceded by a third or sixth to allow stepwise motion. The organal voice is more disjunct than the chant because of the limited number of harmonic intervals from which the singer may choose. Yet, this style of organum offers much more freedom than its predecessors, allowing the singers and the composers to show their artistry while decorating the liturgical chant. During the next several centuries, polyphony was primarily the responsibility of the soloist, not the choir. This arrangement makes sense in several ways. By long tradition, the most ornate chants, the responsorial psalms were mainly sung by soloists, and it was appropriate for them to take the lead in any further musical elaborations of the service. Soloists typically sang the tropes, and the polyphony was similar to troping as an addition to the authorized chant. Most important, only a soloist could improvise a free organal line against a given chant, so that when note against note organum came to be written down, it was already associated with solo performance. Although older style of organum could be sung by choirs and used for any chant, note against the note organum and the later styles were used only where soloists sang, primarily in the solo portions of graduals, alleluias, and the office responsories, and the interrupt section of the mass ordinary. Polyphony did not stand alone. Rather, soloists singing polyphonic sections alternate with monophonic chant sung by choir. So I'm going to show you an example of a note against a note organum. The name is ad organum faciendum, Alleluia Justus ut palma. Yeah. Now I'm going to talk about the Aquitanian polyphony. So early in the 12th century, singers and composers in France developed a new, more ornate type of polyphony. It is known today as Aquitanian polyphony because the main sources are three manuscripts once held in the Abbey of Saint Martyr and copied in Aquitanian notation. Most polyphony was improvised using conventions and formulas developed by singers and recorded in paper of the time, and even the pieces that scribed preserved in notation were most likely composed orally and fixed in memory rather than worked out on paper. Aquitanian polyphony includes setting of chant, such as the sequence and Benedicamus tropes, but most of the repertoire comprise settings of verses rhyming and metric Latin poems, which were also set monophonically. Some theorists of the time describe two main polyphonic styles, both evident in the Aquitanian polyphony. This counter style occurs when both parts move at about the same rate, with 1, 2, 3 notes in the upper part for each note of the lower voice. Organum style now refers to texture in which the upper voice sings note groups of varying lengths above each note of the lower voice, which accordingly moves much more slowly than the upper. This style is known today as florid organum because of the florid upper part. In both styles, the lower voice holds the principal melody and is called the tenor. And nowadays, tenor's meaning is the to hold. This term did not come to mean high male voice until centuries later. So, and in both styles, the upper part elaborates on underlying note against note counterpoint with the tenor. So this style illustrated in the two passages from the Jubilamus, Exultamus, verses whose tenor was apparently newly composed. This picture used the style of a florid organum with melismas of 3 to 15 notes in the upper part for most notes in the tenor. So you can see that, the first one is the florid organum. So another picture, the bottom one shows a passage in the discount style with 1 to 3 notes in the upper part for each tenor note until the last but one syllable, which typically has a longer melisma. In both excerpts, a contrast motion is more common than the parallel, and most note group in the upper voice begin on a perfect consonant with the tenor. The lower step in each example shows the underlying note against the note polyphony between the voices that is decorated by the more florid motion of the upper part. As in note against a note organum, phrase and octaves or unison, heightening the sense of closure. So I'm going to show you another example of the Aquitanian polyphony named Jubilemus Exultamus.
Jubilemus exultemus, intonemus canticum.
The first high voice is the florid organ. So again, the first high voice is a florid organum style, meaning is the singer sings with decoration with the parallel the organum and the note against the note organum. They use all kind of method together. So now we are going to talk about the Notre Dame polyphony. Everybody knows Notre Dame Cathedral, right? That here is so famous in the world, but the church was burnt by accident. So I'm so sad about it. But in the 13th century, from there so many beautiful music was born. So musicians in and around Paris developed a still more ornate style of polyphony in the late 12th and early 13th centuries. The creators of this style were associated with the University of Paris, which furthered the intellectual atmosphere for this new style and where several of them had studied, and with the new Church of Paris, Notre Dame, one of the grandest Gothic cathedrals. Notre Dame took almost a century to build. The first mass celebrated in 1183. During this time, musicians at or connected to Notre Dame and in the region of Paris created a new repertoire and complexity, including the first body of music for more than two independent voices. Such elaborate music was valued for its artistry in decorating the authorized chant, making important services more impressive, and the paralleling in sound the stunning size and the beautiful decoration of the building itself. So this repertoire from the Notre Dame was sung for more than a century, from the late 12th century to the 14th century, and was spread and imitated across much of Europe, from Spain to Poland and from Italy to Scotland. Music historians long regard it as the first polyphony to be primarily composed in writing and read from notation rather than improvised or orally composed. But the recent research complicates that view. According to records of the ceremonies at the Notre Dame, neither chant nor polyphony was performed from the notation. The earliest surviving manuscripts of Notre Dame polyphony date from the 1240s, decades after the repertoire began to be created. The musical text of individual pieces can vary considerably from the one manuscript to the next in a manner that suggests oral rather than a written transmission. A paper copied in Paris in the early 1200s, now preserved at the Vatican in Rome, describes how to improvise organum in a Notre Dame style, including numerous melodic gestures that are present throughout the repertoire. All this evidence indicates a florid body of polyphony developed by singers and preserved in memory before it was written down. How such the vast and complex repertoire was remembered and how it was written down are aspects that make this music especially significant in the music history. So musicians at the Notre Dame developed the first notation since ancient Greece to indicate the notation, duration, a step of great importance for later music in its final form. Their system was described in the 13th century. The book attributed to Johannes de Garlandia. Instead of using note shapes to show relative duration, as in modern notation, they used combinations of note groups to indicate different patterns of longs, meaning it's a long notes, and breves, meaning it's a short notes. According to Garlandia, there were 6 basic patterns called modes, known today as the rhythmic modes. These were identified by number and are shown here both as the patterns of longs and breves and in modern transcriptions. So look at this picture, and as you see the mode from the first to 6 and the original notation. In the mode 1, the first note look like a quarter. This is the long, and another things. The next one is breves. So the basic time unit, the tempus, here the transcript as an 8th note was always grouped in 3s, as in the modern matter of 3/8 or 6/8. This grouping resulted naturally from the alternation in modes 1, first and 2 of a long and a brave. So for your understanding, I'm gonna show you another lecture video by Music Corner. So explain about the breves and the longs.
Our current rhythmic system is based around proportions by doubles and halves. 2 half notes are equal to a whole note, 1 half note is equal to 2 quarter notes, and so on. We are used to whole notes, half notes, quarter notes, 8th notes, and 16th notes. And you might have seen shorter note values. There is also a note value twice the length of a whole note, the double whole note, or breve. The original Latin word is brevis, which means short. So a note so long that we barely use it used to be the short note. How did this happen? Well, the basic process is this. The beginnings of our rhythmic notation in Europe back in the Middle Ages started with 2 note values, the long, longa, and the short, brevis. The earliest Catholic worship music in clear pitch notation, Gregorian chant, used ligatures, note shapes that connected multiple pitches that had no specific rhythmic meaning. As church music expanded to include polyphony, composers wanted sections of the music to have distinctive rhythms, and they arranged ligatures in specific patterns to give their music a wonderful lilt. Long, short, long, short, long, short, long, short, long. As time went on and styles changed over the centuries, musicians came up with new ways to organize musical time through rhythmic notation, and many of these changes required shorter and shorter note values. And alongside these new note values, the note value that went with the pulse, in mensural music, the tactus, in metered music, the beat, also became shorter and shorter, until the breve, the short, became the longest value. Thanks for watching Music Corner Breve. Please like.
So I'm going to talk about the Magnus Liber Organi. This is the book. So This is the book about the 1285, known as Anonymous the Fourth. We know the names of the two musicians associated with creating polyphony for Notre Dame. Names are Leoninus and Perotinus. Leoninus served at the Cathedral of Paris in many capacities, the beginning in the 1150s, before the current building was begun. He was a canon at the Notre Dame, became a priest, and was connected with the monastery of Saint Victor as a poet. He wrote a paraphrase of the first 18 books of the Bible in verse and several shorter works. Little is known about the Perotinus, but he must have held an important position at the cathedral. The book's reference to both as a master suggests that both earned the Master of Arts degree at the school that would become the University of Paris, a center of intellectual innovation intertwined with the Notre Dame Cathedral since the last decades of the 12th century. Anonymous the First called Leoninus an excellent organista, meaning a singer or composer of organ, and credits him with compiling a Magnus Liber Organi. This collection contained the two voice settings of the solo portions of the responsorial chant for the major feasts of the church year. To undertake such a cycle, elaborating the chants that were the central musical focus of the year's most important services shows a vision as grand as that of those building Notre Dame Cathedral. But Leoninus did not undertake it alone, despite Anonymous the First testimony. Like building the cathedral, creating this repertoire was a collective project. We could not be certain that, Leoninus' role was, though we may guess that he was a leading figure in its creation or preservation. No great book services from the Leoninus' lifetime, and it is not even certain whether music was written down then. But the repertoire he helped to develop is contained in later manuscripts, primarily two now in German and one in Italy. We do not know how much of the surviving music is by Leoninus. The many variants that occur between the first versions of the same piece suggest that much of the music was transmitted orally. Moreover, it is clear that the musicians during and after Leoninus' time freely altered and added to the collection. The manuscripts offer a different setting for the same passages of chant, often presenting several alternatives, and include organette for 2, 3, or 4 voices, as well as pieces in the newer genre of conductus and motet. Clearly, the Great Book was not a fixed canon, but a florid repertoire from which material could be chosen for each year's services. So, keep going on for the organum in the style of Leoninus. The version of the Wiederund omnes in the earlier German manuscript, which also appears in the virtually the same form in the Italian manuscript, may be the earliest surviving setting of this melody in the Notre Dame repertoire. Although we cannot attribute it to Leoninus with certainty, we assume it resembles the polyphony he sang. It is in two voices and figures two different styles of the polyphony, organum and the discant. Paralleling the contrast we observed in the Aquitanian polyphony, only the solo portions of the chant, the intonation of the response and most of the verse were sung polyphonically. The choir sang the remaining portions in unison, so that the three styles, plain chant, organum, and the discant, were heard side by side. The opening intonation on Wiederund shows the exemplifies organum styles. The chant melody appears in the tenor in a measured long notes, like a series of the drones. Over these subsamed tones, the upper voice, called the duplum, sings expansive melismas, moving mostly stepwise, often staying on a dissonance with the tenor and cadencing from time to time on an octave, fifth, or unison followed by rest. Ligatures in the original notation are shown here by horizontal brackets. Descending neumes by dashed slur, by small notes slurred to the preceding note. The notation does not clearly indicate any rhythmic mode, suggesting that the duplums should be sung in free rhythm, although some scholars and performers have applied modal rhythm. Most of this setting is in organum style, but it is punctuated by passages in discant style, where both voices move in modal rhythm. The longest discant passage in the Wiederund omnes is on the syllable do of Dominus, shown in part in the picture on PPT. So as you can see, the first verse is starting with do. So in the original chant, this was by far the longest melisma. Scholars have suggested that Leoninus and his colleagues set the long melismas in discant style because organum, with its lengthened tenor note, would have made the music too long. Those changes of the style in the polyphony from organum to discant and back occur precisely where in the chant the style changes from pneumatic text setting to melismatic and back. In this section, the phrases are relatively short, usually 4 or 6 longs in the tenor as in organum. Phrase and on a unison, fifth or octave, but here consonance is more pervasive, with the perfect consonants on almost every long. So the organa of Leoninus and his colleagues were in their day by far the longest and the most elaborate settings of the chant ever created. In complicated melody around the liturgical chant, they were worthy musical analog to the sculptures and the figuration that decorated Notre Dame Cathedral, then still under construction, or the scholastic theologians detailed commentary on scripture. They must have filled the cathedral with sound, overpowering the sense of the hearing, just as the tall columns, stained glass windows, and the delicate stonework overwhelmed the sense of the sight and moving worshippers to deeper devotion. But they would not be the last word. So I'm going to show you the type of organum at the time. So first is organum duplum, meaning is a two-voice organum. Second is a triplum, meaning is a three-voice organum. The last one is a quadruplum, meaning is a four-voice organum. So now I'm gonna share the video named Widerrund Omnes, which is I talked about the Leoninus organum style. So this has so many styles, the organum styles. So please focus on the here, listen the music so well, because it is quite too long. But I'm gonna play the whole music for your understanding. Sorry, I was in a restroom, so I didn't know if I use a mute, the music is not on. So I'm so sorry. I will play the music from the The music is so beautiful, right? I'm so impressed to listen this whole music, and they use so much decorate and elaborate the singing style at the time, and that is a huge development than the before the 12th or 11th century like that. So for now, lastly, I'm going to talk about the motet. So musicians at the Notre Dame create a new genre in the early 13th century by adding newly written Latin words to the upper voices of dissonant clausula, uh, analog to the way earlier musicians had added text to chant melismas to create sequences and texture tropes. The resulting piece was called the motet. Over the course of the century, poets and composers developed a new form of the motet, including some with French words, secular topics, 3 or more voices or rhythmic patterns, increasingly free of the rhythmic modes. As organum and conductus gradually fell out of fashion in the middle of the century, the motet became the leading polyphonic genre for both sacred and secular music, evolving from the texture trope of the clausula to a newly composed piece valued for its complex patterns and multiple layers of meaning. So, a typical early motet is Factume est salutare Dominus. Since the poet fit the words to the existing duplum melody, the varying number of the notes in each short praise required him to write a poem with irregular line lengths. Accentuation and the rhythm, a rhyme scheme, like many early Latin motets based on the clausula, this text is a kind of the trope on the original chant text, and elaborating its meaning and drawing on its words or sound. The poem ends with the word dominus, on which the tenor melody was originally sung, and incorporates several other words from the chant, some of which are echoed in subsequent rhymes. The discount clausula, a musical decoration of the word, is here in turn embellished by the addition of words, both referring back to the original chant and its words drawn from the psalm. The resulting motet is an ingenious composite artwork with multiple layers of borrowing and of meaning. In an ecclesiastical culture that treasured commentary, allegory, and the new ways of reworking traditional themes, such pieces must have been highly esteemed for their many allusions. When, where, and how motets were performed are interesting question. Sacred motets might have been performed in services, but we assume that the secular ones were not, although the language of the love often resembled the vocabulary of devotion. Motets were almost certainly music for the education elite, including the church people and teachers, university students, poetics, musicians, and their patrons. Since the words in the tenor no longer needed to be sung, the tenor part may have been played on an instrument, but there is no clear evidence to indicate whether this was customary. So by 1250, three-voice motets were the rule, with two texts on related topics in Latin or French, or occasionally one in each language. After mid-century, composers drew motet tenor melodies from the sources other than Notre Dame clausule, including other chants and secular music. The tenor became simply a cantus firmus, a term introduced around the 1270s by the theorist Hieronymus de Moravia to designate an existing melody, usually a plain chant, on which a new polyphonic work is based. The further motet composers moved away from adding text to a clausula, the more they needed a new rhythmic notation. The rhythmic modes were notated through patterns of the ligatures. Except for the tenor, motets were predominantly syllabic. Each syllable required a separate note, so ligatures could no longer be used to indicate rhythm. Sorry. Scribes noted early motets in the two versions, with words and without, and only the latter showed the rhythm. Later motets followed the rhythmic modes less closely, in part by subdividing many notes and their increasing rhythmic variety and complexity called for a new notational system. Composer and theorist Franco of Cologne codified the new system, now called Franconian notation, in this in Ars Cantus Mensurabilis, written around the 1280s. For the first time, relative duration was signified by note shapes, a characteristic of Western notation ever since. This is such an important innovation, and it had such an impact on what musicians could notate, that we should pause to examine how Franco's system worked. There were 4 signs for single notes. Please look at the picture. So like the rhythmic modes, the Franconian notation is based on ternary grouping of the basic unit, the tempus. 3 tempora constitute the perfection, akin to the measure of 3 beats. As in the rhythmic modes, a long may last 2 or 3 tempora, and a breve is normally 1 tempus, but can last 2 tempora if needed to feel perfection. A double long has the value of 2 longs, and the tempus may contain 2 or 3 semi-breves. Signs for rest and for ligatures indicate the duration in a similar manner. What would transcribe as ties across the bar line were not possible to notate except for double longs. Changes in motet style and the notation led to a new way of laying out the music. Scribes wrote the earliest motets in score, like the clausule from which they were derived, but the upper voices with with each syllable needing a separate note, took up almost more room on the page than the tenor, which had fewer notes and could be written in ligatures. In a score, there would be long, unoccupied stretch in the tenor staff, a waste of a pace, the space and the paper. And since the upper voice song sang different text, it seemed natural to separate them. So in a three-voice motet, the triplum and the motetus came to be written either on the facing pages or in separate columns on the same page. It remained the customary way of notating polyphony from 1280s until the 16th century. So I'm going to show you the video of early motet named Factum est salutare Dominus. So as you can see, they sang different line. I'm gonna read it one more time. So first line sing with the octopus salutare. The second line sing ominous. So this is the first attempt of organum style. I mean motet style. So this video shows that the later in the 13th century style, the name Dongmin Byeon and Deus Kumang Porua, meaning is the first one is Latin, but the second duplum is French, and the third one tenor is Latin, or the played by instrument. So as you see, triplum sing Latin text, meaning is from my lady comes the grievous pain which I bear and of which I will die. And duplum sing French, meaning is God, how can I find a way to go to him, whose love I am. And the tenor sing as a basement. So that kind of decoration and elaboration, the combination made a good music style named motet. So please, please remember what is the motet. So motet is so important. So motet is so important, not only for this time, but also you can see the next time and the next time. Like so many composers used the motet form for composing Christian music. So for today, that's it. So, and I'm going to talk about Ars Nova and Guillaume de Machaut next time. So they are that these are so important for the medieval era. Meaning is, that medieval era is going to Renaissance era, and you can see the Reformation era. So before that period, that was like the Ars Nova and the Guillaume de Machaut were the first starting point to change their music style. So please keep eyes on these lectures, and see you soon, and have a great week. Thank you so much.